Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Skorka. I'm president of Opera America, and welcome to the National Opera Center and our Creators in Concert program this evening, April 5th. Creators in Concert is an extension of our core commitment to encouraging the production of American opera. Over the years, we have made more than $13 million in grants to support creation and production, workshop, and audience development activity associated with creating an American opera repertoire that we are thrilled is thriving at opera companies large and small across North America. We've expanded our general commitment to include our Opera Grants to Female Composers program, where we give out discovery and commissioning grants to female composers. And our fingers are crossed that we're going to introduce a parallel program for composers of color. We're waiting for a big foundation decision about that. But we hope to continue to broaden the number of creative voices and stylistic talent that are welcomed into the opera world so we can be as reflective of the world we live in today as we wish to be. This event takes place at New York's National Opera Center. Here in New York today, it has been a miserable, rainy, cold, windy day, although the sun has come out in time for this program. I say that to let those know who are watching by remote means that the people in this room are stalwart supporters of American opera, while you at home are just able to sit back and enjoy it. I will say, though, that we have a couple of enhancements that may be new to our live audience and to our audience on camera. One is this. Oh, it's not on there right now. We have, for the interview part, we have a little backdrop that you'll see that just enlivens the back wall. And I'm also carrying my tablet because more and more we are getting questions via email during our live video. And I want to be able to see those so that way, as I'm speaking with our guest composer, I have an opportunity to introduce some of the questions that have come into us from our remote audience. Bill Bolcom was the keynote speaker at our 2001 annual conference in Atlanta. He was in the middle at that time of completing his third consecutive commission for the Lyric Opera of Chicago in a 10-year period, a rare commitment of an opera company to the work of a single composer, especially at that point in the development of the American opera repertoire. Bill Bolcom is one of the most versatile American composers today, and I would say ever. When I went onto his website and I clicked onto the button that said Works, the subcategories came up: band, chamber, chorus, keyboard, orchestra, opera and stage, and vocal. There aren't many composers who have catalogs filled in each of those subcategories. Tonight we'll hear excerpts from his latest opera, Dinner at 8, that premiered just last month at the Minnesota Opera. We'll also listen to excerpts of some of his other works, all introduced to us by the composer himself. I'll return after the music with a few questions from my own notes here, from you, and from our audience wherever they may be. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming Bill Bolcom.
Wow. Wow. I guess you brought the nice weather. It was a squall when we came here about an hour or so ago, and here it is, sunny outside. Must have been your good spirit. Thank you. So, where should I start? I probably should start at the beginning, and then when I come to the end, stop, is that famous thing. To start with this whole thing, I think maybe, Mark, was I supposed to talk about my history, or should I talk about each of the songs, or what should we do?
I'll talk to you about your history when I'm up there. So.
Great. Oh, good. Then you're saved. All right. We're going to start with a couple of songs from, or arias, I should say, from the new opera, Dinner at 8, which I did, of course, with the world's go-to librettist, Mark Campbell, who every new opera, you look, there he is. He's got 15 to his credit already, and it's incredible, very easy to work with. And it was like, I had a grand time with it. Minnesota Opera is so professional at putting on new things. This was the 45th they've done in a 50-some-year career as the Minnesota Opera. And they really knew how to do everything. They had the whole details things I never thought, they were already there. I mean, the only time that, having been in the theater before I got involved with opera, of course, I was involved with casting, especially, and everybody had to go to, Actors Equity. Anybody who wants to try for anything can be, if they're a member of Equity, you have to see them. And then you come back for callbacks. And I remember this was 1990. We were doing a thing with the American Music Theater Festival, which I see two friends of mine probably were there. And this is Philadelphia, of course. And anyway, so I had just gone through a week and a half of callbacks, every kind of walk-on. I had 6 choices, and I thought, oh, it was going to be like that. And then I got a call from Artist Kranick. This was going to be for my first opera, for lyric opera, McTeague. And she said, come to Tannhäuser, because the fellow was going to be the second banana. I forget what the part was. This was Ben Heppner, it turns out. And he was just new to this was his first major role. And what happened was, I got there, so I sat through Tannhäuser, and the guy who was singing Tannhäuser was having one hell of a time, vocal problems. But anyway, that's all right. He got through it somehow, croaking through. It was one of those things where they did the whole thing in an airport lounge or something. That's, and it means. Anyway, so the next day I get to see Artist, and she has brought me Ben Heppner, and he sings 3 or 4 arias, and in different languages, all of which were perfectly acted and enunciated. And then he got to English, which was a crowning achievement. I mean, this was the time when very few singers could be understood at all when they sang. And Ben was clear as a bell. And so I was just absolutely knocked out by him. So he goes away. Artist says, what do you think? I said, he's absolutely marvelous. But don't you think, out of fairness, we should look to the other 10 Eldon tenors in the next room? He says, there aren't any others. And you better take him because he's died it up till 1994. So I actually did an article in Opera America, how different the musical theater world was from the opera world. One of the things I found that I've not yet found any kind of exception to, whatever is true in the one is exactly the opposite in the other. Which is very odd, including the contract. The contract were, actually, I will preface this a little bit by, I would work with Robert Altman on McTeague, and I had asked, actually, Artist asked me who would I like to have for the director, and I said, Robert Altman. She said, who is that? It just goes to show how watertight all these categories are. Anyway, he was there in Paris. He was going to do a thing with the RAI Italian radio or TV about Rossini and Stendhal. Stendhal wanted to meet Rossini, somehow never did. So he did a kind of totally fabricated, very funny book called La Vie de Rossini. It has absolutely nothing to do with his life. And in the meantime, there's, Rossini's going one door of the Paris Opera, and Stendhal's going the other one. And later, Stendhal goes in, and Rossini comes out. The film was never made because it turns out that Bob would not hire one of the radio executives' mistress and so that was the end of that. But meantime, we were in the little Paris Opera Library. It was a wonderful round circular thing with fantastic scores, and also all the papers about Rossini, including his tailor bills, things like I love this part of it. The how much it cost and what was the stop. The carriage from Rome to Naples, which took a day and a half, and the end you had to stop and everything else. And the best part I remember, which is very funny, a 4-page contract with somebody in Britain, which was 13, 14, whatever it was, and a 4-page, and it looked very much like the contract I would eventually have with lyric opera. Hardly changed, except for one thing. On the last page of the British contract, it said, this contract, as with every other contract, is null and void upon the death of the king. So anyways, what happens is that, of course, he did come, and Bob did direct McTeague. He actually had a lot to do with what's called the scenario, which is what this particular scene must accomplish. And the details will be filled out by Arnold Weinstein, my longtime collaborator. So that's what that whole thing was about. So it was the beginning of maybe the crossover of film directors involving with the opera, which is in certain ways good, but I certainly had a grand time with Bob. The third opera for lyric would turn out to be made from his film, A Wedding. Now that's nothing to do with what we're going to be hearing right now, except that, but Bob is gone, Arnold is gone, Arthur Miller, whom I worked with at View from the Bridge, and I'm still here. Well, anyway, about these two songs you're going to hear, I got very interested around 2008 because I had actually looked at the film Dinner at 8, and then I went and bought the script from Dramatist Play Service downtown, and it's much different from the film. It's much tougher. All the funny things that you might remember if you've seen the film, like there's one point where Jean Harlow and Marie Dresser are going to dinner, and Jean Harlow says, well, I read a book, and Marie Dresser goes, but no, all that was in the film. We were enjoying from using any of the film stuff. Also, Dan Packard, who is this unscrupulous businessman, reminding me very much of a certain person who happens to be our president. And anyway, I try not to mention his name, but it's much tougher. But you couldn't have Wallace Beery be an unreconstructed baddie. The guy in the opera and the play is. So it turns out to be a much darker show, even though it's funny and all of a sudden than the film is. Well, the film is great in its own way, but the opera is a little darker. They're still funny, but there's a kind of an overawing, because 2008 is when I really decided I wanted to do this, and this is, of course, you remember, of course, the big financial crisis and the whole other things that have been inhabiting us ever since. So it seemed very timely to me. So the two arias we're going to be hearing, may I have a program so I'll have everything in the right order? Thank you, my darling. This is my wife, Joan Morris, who does more than... and she does, and has done much more than giving her husband a program. So, all right, to start with, I want to look at all this. Beautiful put together, created in concert, very handsome. Dinner at 8, libretto by Lobster and Aspic. The lovely socialite will be sung by Chelsea Shephard. She will sing a song called Lobster and Aspic because she suddenly decided to have a dinner date. She has the famous, not uncommon Anglophilia that you would find from a lot of the Upper East Side residents of New York then and now. We're talking about 1932. And she finally decides that's the dish that's going to do it. Paula's aria. Paula is the daughter of Millicent, the socialite, and her husband, Oliver, who's had a shipping company and has terrible health problems and is going to have his whole empire stolen from him by this man, Dan Packard, who he has to invite for that dinner. Those are the two things you'll hear there. A View from the Bridge was, of course, our collaboration with Arthur Miller, who was a love to work with in every kind of way. I could not have imagined. Because first of all, you must cut a play to make it a reasonable size. Otherwise, if you said every word, and Arthur was constantly sent a first act of a whole opera in which every little word was said, which meant that when you're finishing a regular 2-hour Broadway play, it's like Parsifal. So you really have to know what to cut and why. He was so ruthless about what to cut and what we needed and what we didn't know. He held on to what he knew was important. It was a fantastic collaborator. And so you'll hear, this is the aria in which Catherine, who's the niece of Eddie Carboni and who causes all the terrible problems in the end, because he doesn't know his own conflicted feelings about her. She's suddenly 17 years old and he can't face the fact he's physically attracted to her. And she's trying to describe to Rodolfo, who is one of those two stowaways that were now staying in this tiny apartment in Red Hook, that because he's been so mean, so angry, mostly because he sees this young man and that Catherine's sort of fallen for this young man. And he's saying, oh, why don't go away and get away? And he seems so mean now. And then she sings, but you do not know this man. Nobody knows this man like I know him. There's a certain kind of almost subtle rivalry between her and Catherine, her aunt, but they both really love Eddie, but it's not that stressed. It's just a matter of nobody's really very self-aware. And in fact, I think Eddie will go to his death not knowing what he's done wrong. So that's the story there. I Will Breathe a Mountain is one of the 11 songs I was requested to do by one Marilyn Horne. She wanted all American women poets. The one she insisted on was Emily Dickinson doing The Bustle in the House, which is a poem she read at her own brother's funeral. Everything else was I had the great luck of working with a wonderful poet, actually, who was also in it, this whole piece, Alice Fulton. And I asked her, just because I could have picked the poems myself, I'd done this in other cases, but I thought the idea is having a really good poet pick the rest of the poems. May Swenson was suddenly in my consciousness. In fact, May died very shortly after she had written this poem, I Will Breathe a Mountain. It's a very powerful poem. The cabaret songs. At one point I asked Arnold, why don't we do some cabaret songs? And he said, I don't know, it's cabaret, what is cabaret? Back in the time when you had those whole Sunday listings of everything, instead of having some critic tell you what you're supposed to like, you had a situation where there's a whole section called cabaret, which is sort of a catch-all. It's like whatever, nobody knew what cabaret was, so it had no shape. So we felt that probably it was a good idea to try to give it one. And this is one of them called Love of the 30s, which is about Arnold, 10 years old, growing up he was in Harlem in the Bronx when he was a boy. And his dad was the kind of person that now you see and now you don't. You know, he was sometimes gone, something what they call a Luftmensch. And he really was kind of like that. But he was a very funny guy. He had a wonderful nutty sense of humor, which was probably inherited by his son, Arnold. And here's Arnold, 10 years old, talking to his dad. And that was Love in the 30s. You'll hear this little conversation going on between dad and kid. And Adrian Rosas does a wonderful job on this. The Beggar's Opera, which was such a pleasure to hear since I hadn't heard it since 1978. Joan was Polly in the production at the Guthrie Theater in 1978. What had happened is that Michael Feingold had been rummaging through some library, and here is this printed volume of some songs, which are these tones that John Gay put together in 1728. There have been various versions from Pepusch way back at the time. My Lord, lots of other people have done them. And so Mio had done about 36, there's about 69 cues altogether. And so he'd done so many. And then Alvin Epstein, who was then heading Guthrie, Steve Blyer, who had been his assistant, also helped a lot, and I think they were together for a while. Anyway, he asked me, would I set the other ones? Now, Mio had just died a few years before. I think in 76, I think he died. Anyway, so it was like a posthumous collaboration. So I would take, you know, he had done the first number. In fact, that's what I love the idea, because he started with an interesting cue. The first thing you heard was a where I sent to, where I laid on Greenland's coast. People used to transport, in other words, get rid of their criminals and put them off in Greenland or something, or Australia. And so, he did it like a samba. And that's the kind of things I always loved about Mio. He loved playing with popular music in different ways. So he did this thing, so I said, okay, I'll counter with that. So I mean, my particular settings, I did about the other, he did some 30 and I did some 30. And we did a production at the Guthrie Theater starring Joan as Polly. And what you're hearing here is the Turtle Dove, one of the songs that she would have sung. Man May Escape was McKeith, and he's just gotten into trouble because of his sort of two ladies who both think he's going to marry them. And in the days of my youth, which was done by Mistress Quickly, who had been the famous madam, done by the great Martha Schlama, who was brought in. Martha and Alvin and I used to do a show called the Courteville Cabaret, which was then taken over by Steve Blyer at the piano. And we brought her in. Well, there was only one little verse for her, and so we added more. Some of the words in that, and there's a little bit more of a grand number, because Martha was a real diva, and she's up there, we got to show her off. So that's an extended one. How Cruel Are the Traitors, I think Lucy is the rival to Polly for the favors of McKeith. And the last one is Oh, What Pain. Oh, what pain it is to part. Now, in the days of my youth, is a kind of a jazz waltz. How Cruel the Traitors sounds kind of a little bit more like Mio. Oh, What Pain, as you'll see, is a kind of a soft rock. And Chelsea Shephard and Adrian Rosas will do the McKeith and Polly parts. And I will not give away the fun of what the three other ladies, Mikaela and Amanda and Amy, will do. There you are. Good. Thank you. And very thank you for that.
but not too much. Oh,
Paula is their daughter, and she's gotten involved with this has-been silent movie star who is really on the skids, which explains this is Larry, and you'll find out.
You've been drinking, Larry. at will. I sucking, pushing, I will breathe a valley. I will breathe a mountain.
Dad? Can we live in the elevator building? Kid, with our luck, we'd live on the ground floor. Dad? Why aren't we communists? Kid, we can't afford it. Dad, I saw the devil on the fire escape. Long, pointed, pussy ears. What kind of devil is that, kid? No tail, no horns. Crawl into bed with your mother and me. Dad? Is there a heaven? Heaven there is, kid, and it's right here. People in heaven are dying to get into this place. Dad, what is a death wish? I hear this death wish, and I wish I was dead. Dad? Who am I? That's a good question, kid. We'll let you know, you'll see. Dad, how will I see? You'll see by the light of your silvery heart. I'm talking science now, kid. Dad, what is the soul? Sort of a sigh with a wink in it, something like that. Ah, what the hell? Gee, Dad, you know everything. Dad, will I always find you? Kid, behind the label, under the table, you'll find me, and I'll find you. And I'm still talking science. Dad? Kid, now close your eyes and you will see. All right, behind your sight, a light the size of a poppy seed on a Danish to go. Now let's put out that light and go to sleep. Nay, some have outlived the doctor's pill, who takes a woman must be undone, that basilisk is sure to kill. The fly that sips treacle is lost in the sweets, so he that tastes woman, 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 he that tastes woman, ruin meets.
How cruel are the traitors who lie and swear
stage change here. You're just going to stay up with me for a second, and we're going to get some chairs here.
Oh, that's lovely. That would be very nice.
Yep, and some water.
That would be even nicer.
And a table.
What more could one? What's not to like? So, great. Thank you, thank you. Lovely glasses of water, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, Bill, do you think of yourself as a funny person? You have such a musical sense of humor. Do you think of yourself as writing with a sense of humor?
I think the only humor is coming from the fact you also have a sense of tragedy. The two are very much related. One of the things I loved about Dinner at 8 was that full of jokes and very great darkness at the same time. But I think that what I've loved to do was to be able to deal with all of these things on a kind of a seesaw, a kind of a balance. I've always been interested in balance. And what is also interesting to me is I can't write an opera or write a song or write anything without a sense of the character who's going to be doing it. So I go from character out from there toward the music.
Well, I'm going to chat with you a little bit about some of the opera composition within your total output, which is so varied. But turning the clock back a little bit, you started studying composition at the age of 11.
Actually, it was earlier. I started at 8.
How did this come to be?
Well, I showed a certain amount of precocity when I was a small boy. As I told you maybe already, I'd learned to play the piano at the age of 4 and gone on. And as I said, I had entertained the troops at 6 and 7 when I was in Seattle. And I began to compose at the same time. In fact, I realized that I was not so interested in becoming a concert pianist as I would want to be a composer. And I just ended up and was very happy with it. I had all of this came extremely easily for me. My actual music I've saved is from the age of 11.
That's absolutely remarkable. And of course, your teachers included Darius Milhaud, as you mentioned, Olivier Messiaen, one of my favorite composers.
Who was actually, at that time, he was not allowed when I was there at the conservatoire. The more conservative composition teachers, not Milhaud, thought that he was turning people into little Messiaens. Well, they turned themselves into little Messiaens. So there's, and I think that what happened in he finally went probably to teaching privately, but still teaching a course of musical aesthetics, in which he was absolutely marvelous. He seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge about music, and they were wonderful, absolutely riveting. 12 hours a week, we sat there at the feet of the master and listened to him. I didn't take any composition. George Benjamin began to work with him. I don't know whether they worked with him at the conservatoire or separately, but George is probably the most prominent person that is beside me that have actually worked with
Messiaen?
With Milhaud, yeah. But not Messiaen, but Messiaen, he did work with Messiaen. Yeah.
Well, and if did you write any organ music?
Quite a bit.
Really?
Yeah. Much of it was inspired and actually written for the wonderful composer and organist William Albright. And Bill and I also got very much involved with the ragtime revival in the late 60s, and had a lot to do with the rediscovery of Scott Joplin, and I wrote quite a number of rags myself, and so did Bill. They're wonderful rags.
Again, your versatility is what is so amazing to us. Where we're talking about opera and rag and organ music and Olivier Messiaen. When you're commissioned to write an opera, do you say to yourself, darn, there goes 3 years of my life? Or do you say, wonderful, I get to work on the biggest canvas of them all?
Kind of both.
How does opera fit into this incredible mix?
Opera is a lot of work, and if you're going to do it, you better like the ones like the opera you're working on. And so I don't think I've ever been willing or able to work on something that I really did not like to do. I'd come through it through musical theater. I'd actually done 3 operas for actors, because at the time I was working in the 1960s when I wrote the first one for actors called Dynamite Tonight, which was done by the Actors Studio Theater, involving people like Barbara Harris and George Allen Epstein, and so on. I found that these were actors who were musically viable, but you could get the words. They had the interest in getting the words. Many voice teachers at that time were sort of looking at the text as some kind of a mix of phonetics that you happen to put a beautiful voice behind. I once did a little bit of vocal rep myself for a while until I got so disgusted. I think this is way back in the 50s and 60s when I was making money, whatever I can do. I mean, one of the things I did was play for burlesque houses in Seattle, and then I would play at church the next day. But after a while, one of the people I worked with was working on a Brahms lead. You know, Brahms's taste in poems he used was not as impeccable as or Schumann's or Wolf or Fauré might have, but this particular one was a particularly nice poem. I think it was by Goethe. I can't remember exactly what it was. And anyway, I said, Athena, she had a beautiful, big, gorgeous, voluptuous voice. Athena, don't you think this is a really nice poem? She said, oh. And I said, don't you know what the text means? She said, no. I said, don't you think it matters? She said, no. Well, I'm a man who's been involved with words all my life. I had the great pleasure and honor to be able to work with the great American poet Theodore Retke in Seattle because he was teaching there. And so I took a whole year with him. The poet James Wright was in our class. He was already published, and so everybody wanted to sit at the feet of the master. I explained to Retke I didn't think I was going to try to become a poet, but I thought maybe I should learn how to write it a little bit so I'd understand how a poem was made. And that's what I did. And out of that came eventually my fourth symphony, which was sung by Joan Morris, which is one of those great poems called The Rose.
Well, you know, clearly this versatility across music and then into language. But what is it that draws you to the source material for opera? You've used plays, movies, novels. What do you look for?
I remember there was some article in Opera America about somebody talking, what should you take it from a play or a movie or a novel or what else, or a short story. Whatever gives, for me, character that I can then explore musically. The other thing about it is I've always felt that a good setting of a poem will clarify rather than obscure the text. In fact, it's probably because very few poets know how to read their own poems. You'll see them going up to the beautiful poem and they'll read it like it was a stock report. But it's, Dylan Thomas, of course, is the grand exception, and everything else. Probably many other poets were so jealous of him, so then it became unfashionable to sound as grand as Dylan Thomas's own recordings. But if you ever heard them, I mean, he sings his poetry. He's a bard, and that's very important. So I guess the thing was, I always really wanted to be able to clarify the text or the story or the character. And I do this through music so that opera really becomes, in a way, returning to the animal sound. The guy is hammering and he hits his stomach and goes, ow! That's singing. And it comes from pain that he generated himself, of course, but it's like a reconnection with the animal sound. Speech, in other words, is an attenuation of song. Mm-hmm. And that's how I've always looked at it. So now I'm just opening up the attenuation, and we found the song that is implicit in the text.
Do you go periodically on a hunt for what might make good source material for an opera? Or do you just live your life reading books, reading plays, going to the movies, and something strikes you as, that would make a good opera?
Probably more the second. McTeague, for the way, came out with that same kind of thing. When I was at Stanford in 1962, I started improvising, playing for silent movies. And they would send you something from the Museum of Modern Art. Sometimes they'd send you a score, and sometimes they were appropriate, and usually they were not terribly interesting, and sometimes they were very weird. In the great 1917 or so surrealistic movie, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, MoMA sent me Chopin waltzes to play, which I thought was too weird. So I made my own kind of fake expressionistic chord, and so usually I had a chance to see the movie, and then I could sort of wail a kind of a generated improvised score out of them. Greed came, and there was no time to even look at it. So it went cold, and as I was playing for this thing, in fact, it's funny because I did talk about gold, so I sort of used all them golden slippers and sort of used that as kind of a running tune. But, and I got carrying on and think, gee whiz, this could be a heck of a good opera. And then I forgot about it completely. Then I read, oh yes, the girl at the time I was going with told me, read the novel by Frank Norris, called McTeague. And I read it, and I was just impressed by both the movie and the book. In fact, the book actually a bit more. When I got into opera in this particular case, because opera the opera and musical theater workshop actually with the NEA music. And here was artist critic who'd been given the job to kind of supervise the panels and all the rest of it. I was so knocked out by her ability to take care of all these things. She was tough but fair, and I just was so amazed by her. I called my wife and I said, I'm in love, and she said, oh dear. I said, no. I said, no, it's not like that. I just think she's a person I would love to work with someday. Well, my Songs of Innocence was first done in 1984, with a conductor I've worked with since way back, since '67, Dennis Russell Davies. He would premiere my Songs of Innocence out of experience with the Stuttgart Opera. Then it was done by the University of Michigan with the conductor Gustav Meyer. And then we did it in 1986 at Grant Park in Chicago. Artists came back with Bruno Bartoletti, and they said, we want to do an opera. Then they came back and said, we want you to do 4 operas, which I think that came from Matthew Epstein. He suddenly had the idea, why don't we have it like Verdi was in La Fenice, do several. And I think that he did 3 and I did 3 for the same house or something like that. And although I have to verify that someday, but I know he did several for La Fenice. And I've done 3 for lyric opera. I would have done the 4th, but, well, to make a long story short, sadly, Arnold died. And the 4th opera never was finished with lyric.
And I did want to follow that up because certainly to the time in the 1990s, it was rare. There were so few new American operas being done. It would be rare that a single composer was asked to do 3, in fact, asked to do 4 operas. What was the benefit of having that 10-year relationship with one company?
It was longer. It's from all the way from 1986 to 2005.
Sure, exactly, because the first premiere wasn't in, it was 1992, but it took a while.
But I worked with them almost 20 years.
What was the benefit to you as a creative artist in having such an association with a company?
Incalculable. Just the idea of being part of the company. And the difference between theater is that every little production is kind of an ad hoc, very short-term corporation which lasts for the length of the opera and for the play. And then a new play comes in with different people and so on and so forth. In opera, there is this whole construct. There's this house. You walk in the door and you're part of that house. So I was working with them in the spirit of collaboration, which I've always loved doing anyway. One of the things I loved doing when I was working with Paul Sills, who would then direct one of my, actually 2 of my operas for actors, was Paul Sills, who was the founder of Second City. And I would improvise with them. I did that with that on piano, and it was fantastic to be working with the likes of Barbara Harris, Alan Alda, Alan Arkin, Olympia Dukakis, and all these terrific people. And I was in there improvising on the piano with them, and it's just something I just loved. I love to collaborate, the thing that really excites me most. And when I'm dealing with opera singers and a whole bunch of people, I'm working with them. I'm not this autocrat who is going to lay down the law and they have to follow it. I'm much more interested in the spirit of give and take.
Now, you've worked with several librettists, great librettists.
Well, 2 mostly, and that's Arnold Weinstein and now Mark.
Mark, and of course Robert Altman did 1 libretto for you.
I actually worked with Robert Altman, did the scenario.
Okay.
And because he was a scenario in film is a description of what the particular scene must accomplish. In many cases, the scenario was then told the actors, okay guys, just wail with that. There's a very interesting thing in Dalton Trumbo's book, Johnny Got His Gun, showing what a scenario can often be. You give your actors just a thing to do. So what happened is that Bob would put together the scenario, which is to say what has to be accomplished in this scene. And then Arnold would actually fill it up.
That's kind of the way Puccini worked with Giocosa and Ilica, that one did the scenario and the other one did the poetry.
Exactly, so that's what really happened. I think in our case, that's true.
Does a different librettist somehow call out different music from you?
Of course. I think what I did for Mark was a quite different thing than I did for Arnold. Arnold was a poet first and a librettist second. Mark, I think, is pretty much the opposite. He is a librettist first with a certain poetic tendency, but with Arnold I had to deal with a kind of multi-layered poetry.
And that the words and the structure of the words actually call forth a different music from you.
Oh, sure. Actually, that's the one thing that Mark has been lobbying, and this is a perfect place to do this. People I don't know why it has never been done as much as every time I do a residency someplace and they give me a bunch of songs to look at and to criticize and to work with people and so on, I am constantly lobbying every school to be sure you give the poetry equal status. it should be Schubert and Meyerhofer. It shouldn't be just Schubert. It should be, obviously Schumann and Heine, and so on and so forth. And so that we have really got to reinstate the importance of the words, because without the words, there's no music.
You mentioned speaking to younger people, and you, of course, were a distinguished professor of composition for decades at the University
35 years.
of Michigan. And the Academy doesn't allow for much focus on opera. Instrumental composition, maybe short form song.
Well, it depends on where you are. I mean,
And at a great university, you probably have some more
well,
resources.
I mean, for example, Bloomington, my lord, I mean, that's really an opera. It's like walking into a big opera house. It's like, it feels like going into Fitzcarraldo in the middle of nowhere. And Bloomington's in the middle of nowhere, I may tell you.
When you encounter a student who's interested in opera, who wants to create opera, what do you encourage them to study?
Operas.
Any particular composers, any particular
No,
operas?
I think what you got to do is follow everything. Look at how they're done. I had the very good luck when I was an undergraduate at the University of Washington. A friend of mine, Charles Troy, who then ended up teaching the opera course at the University of Washington later, I'd be walking by the practice rooms and Charlie would say, come in here, I have a score of Norma. And we'd sit down and we'd forehand do things and ball it all the parts. And we'd go through absolutely everything. And we went through maybe 20 or 30 operas in my undergraduate time, and that's how I learned something about opera. And then also doing vocal rep and so on. I began to think very interesting things about it. But again, I was trying to get people in singing to pay attention to what they're singing about. Now I think one of the things that we are increasingly seeing, I certainly was very happy about McTeague as we've done it in Linz with an all international cast. Dennis Davies was and it will be phasing out, heading up that company in Linz in the Music Theater. They sang and did McTeague. Their English was impeccable. The main female part is Trina. In one of them, it was a double cast. One of them was a Turkish woman. The other one was a Korean woman. I could understand every word. It was perfectly right. And I'm beginning to, it's not just understanding it because they have to understand what they're singing. And it's not just diction. People and it's not just getting the sounds right. They have to internalize it. The same thing an actor must do.
Well, I'm proving Audrey wrong in our office because the tablet has been silent with questions. So in our last couple of minutes, we can turn the lights to half, perhaps. And are there questions from any of our audience members? I can see a hand. I can't see who's attached to it. So please stand up and ask your question.
Hi. Well, I'm a singer, and just kind of tagging on to what you were just talking about, I just find that your music is so wonderful for the tessitura of each voice part, and that it's really well written and easy to sing. And I wonder if that's something that you consciously think, or when you were learning to write, was that something that you thought about? Or is
Always.
It something that
But I have to tell you, one of the things I think any good composer of opera is better off marrying a singer.
I was going to say that.
And I do push it by her, and she'll say, "Ah, that's good. That's not so." I mean, because I always think of the physicality. I can't sing. I can't. The only thing I can play the piano to a certain extent. I can't do any other instrument. I found out I couldn't play anything else. I tried. We found an old clarinet in the attic that had been my grandfather's, and I took some clarinet lessons with the junior high school teacher in Everett, Washington. I was so terrible after 6 weeks, she said, "I can't stand this, please." Now, I have no talent, and I tried. Oh my gosh, there was another thing. My grandfather had a fake Stradivarius, one of those things that came from Sears, which reminds me of a funny story for a minute. Sergiu Luca, who was a wonderful violinist, for whom I wrote my second violin sonata and also violin concerto, used to go down to Wurlitzer when they were more of the major violin dealers, and he got these funny stories from various people who had been selling or trying to sell opera, selling violins. And so he told me, there's one woman from the South, she says, "Well, I have found this wonderful violin it was my grandfather was in the attic, and I'll tell you it's really authentic because I just thought I'd write down what's in the F-hole." So Antonio Stradivarius 1717 Cremonensis Fecit, made in Czechoslovakia. And so they wrote back, they said, "Well, madam, I don't think it must be possibly not, because Czechoslovakia, of course it didn't exist at that time, but I mean the point was, but Czechoslovakia, he actually only worked in Cremona, and they wrote back, and she wrote back as well. I'm sure I could find a buyer. Besides, he could have made it when he was on vacation.
I love it. What a great story. You know,
Isn't that great?
we'll take one more question, then I don't want to stand long between you and your dinners. Yes?
Bill, you mentioned a little bit that everything in musical theater is the exact opposite from what happens in opera, even the contract. Could you talk a little more specifically, some of the things you found that are particularly different between the two genres in your experience?
Well, the focus in musical theater is probably still more word-oriented than it is in opera, and in opera it's much more music-oriented. I think when it was possible, for example, a century ago, the old Met, before the First World War, might do a production of John Giovanni in which the Don was Russian, he would sing it in Russian, and everybody else would sing it in their own languages, and nobody seemed to think anything wrong with that. But I think that's one of the things. Now, having been a theater man, I needed to have theatrical values to be infused into opera. Otherwise, I would not have been able to do it. I guess what I'm talking about is how it is run, how the structure was. One of the things I mentioned already, Scott, was the fact was that the contracts are very, very different. As I told you, the contracts in musical theater, particularly when you got to the end of the 20s and so on and so forth, had to have all kinds of safeguards because a lot of the money was rather shady. So I think people were trying very much to sort of protect themselves against the mafiosi. So there was that kind of a problem. In opera is a house. It's a construct. You walk into that opera house, you become part of that company while you're there. In musical theater, just as in theater, you have an ad hoc company that is which is, even though it might be with a Nederlander or a Jude Jamson or a Schubert theater, the theater is not the same kind of house. Whatever goes into that particular theater is that play with that company. In opera, you go into that company and you deal with the company all the time. So it's really the difference between a kind of, you walk into this organization. The other one is the organization is purely put together for the sake of the theater. And that'd be true with musical theater too. So that's one of the opposite, as well as how you're paid, how it is done. I was mentioning before how Actors Equity requires you to go, every single every single part has to be auditioned by everybody. If a person is I don't know, could be somebody who might consider totally wrong for the thing, but you still have to audition that person because he or she is a member of Equity. In opera, it's like there's maybe 150 singers everybody's trying to vie for, and they keep changing a little bit, but the same people are asked for. And also, another one I think I can tell you is Arthur Miller was just amazed at how different it is. In a Broadway play, you write your play, you put together your backers, and 6 months later you put on the play, maybe, if you're lucky. In opera, you're going to figure maybe 3 or 4 years before you'll actually have to put it together because everybody's got an outlying several years of already decided operas because it's when you can get whom and so all the rest. So you're all talking about a 4 or 5 year lag. That's one of the differences. I could go on for other things. Maybe I don't know whether that opera news article is still viable. Maybe you can find it on Google or something. But it was really about all those things.
Fascinating. Well, I think we have had the incredible pleasure of being in the presence of a cultural omnivore and a cultural genius who will be joining us out in the lobby where we invite you to have some wine, some cheese and crackers, and good conversation. In the meantime, please join me in thanking the great Bill Bolcom. Thank you so much.